Saturday, January the 17th, 1981, Beshalach. Please turn in the Birnbaum prayer book to page 71. Last week, in our continuing study of the traditional Shacharit service as a text, as a literary text, we arrived at the conclusion that the material which tradition put together in the framework of the Shacharit service remarkably intuits various theoretical notions about what is vitally necessary for society's survival, which we have only become aware of in recent decades, perhaps even years, as basic to the foundation of any human society. And it's not necessarily a happy thought that we arrive at, but one that we ought to be prepared to face if we wish to understand something about the nature of our own community. There were three imperatives which the sociologists insisted were fundamental to the maintenance of the fabric of any human community. They were the imperatives of order, continuity, and triviality. Perhaps the third one was the most difficult one to accept. Those three notions, the idea that there has to be some kind of system, that one cannot live in a condition of permanent chaos and anarchy and revolution, with everybody pulling in different directions at the same time, is a basic problem of any human society. If you want to call it law and order, if you want to call it Torah, if you want to call it structure, it adds up to the same thing. And of course we found that central to an understanding of the Shacharit service is its stress on the centrality of Torah in Jewish life. Among the first benedictions recited by the traditional Jew in the Shacharit service was the blessing that is recited by Jews world over before the Torah is read. That is to say, an affirmation of the need of Torah for the ongoing survival of the Jewish community. And to underline that, not only is the blessing made over the Torah, a blessing is made over the study of the Torah, excerpts from rabbinic literature are studied. In the near future we intend to look more closely into a clarification of those texts which were chosen with an eye on underlining and underpinning the main overall concepts and themes of the service as a whole. So we make a blessing over the Torah, we quote words of the Torah, we invoke the notion of teaching as well as learning in that very beautiful prayer, Ahava Rabbah, where the Hebrew runs that we ask God, Lilmod, Ulelamed, Lishmor, Vela'asot, Ulekayem, et kol divrei Talmud Toratecha b'Ahava. Nothing could more underline the seriousness of the import of the centrality of Torah in the cosmos of the Jew than this constant referral to the idea of order, Torah, in the Shacharit service, which of course we now begin to see as a microcosm of not only Jewish liturgy as a whole, but the Jewish religious experience as a whole. Dozens of references to Torah in the morning service, which we will have one day to look at in greater detail to see exactly the finer nuances and the finer meanings. But above all, this notion that the Torah is there not only to observe, but to learn, to teach, to do, to perform. That is to say, it overflows in all directions in the conduct of life. Surely the idea of order, which the sociologists draw our attention to, the imperative of order, could not be more centrally affirmed throughout the entire Shacharit service when we look at it simply as a text and bracket the theological issue of whether we believe it or whether we don't believe it, whether or not we literally believe in the traditional conception of Torah or not, or some modern reconstructionist version. On any level, Torah means order as opposed to chaos and anarchy. The second imperative was the imperative of continuity, that one cannot live for the moment, that those fly-by-night schemes, those ad hoc attempts to rectify situations in human life which die out because there is no continuity, that this is not the way in which a society survives in any kind of meaningful way. That order is followed by continuity, the continuity of family life, the continuity of children and grandchildren. And this idea too is stressed in the traditional Shacharit service, the idea of v'nihiyeh anachnu v'tze'etza'enu v'tze'etza'ei tze'etza'enu v'tze'etza'ei kol amcha bet Yisrael, that we, our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei toratecha lishma, that we should all know thy name and study thy Torah for its own sake. Thus, the modern imperative, sociologists tell us, are fundamental to the survival of any community. Order, Torah, leads to the tze'etza'enu idea, the idea of banim, that we should raise, in another part of the traditional prayer book, we read in the Sabbath liturgy, which of course I hope one day we will survive and get to, if the continuity and the order still obtains. What is it? V'nizke lirot banim uvenei vanim oskim b'torah uvemitzvot. It's the same kind of an idea, different word for children. That we may be declared or we may be found worthy or meritorious to see our children and our grandchildren studying the Torah. The idea of knowing God's name, it's a very interesting term. It's unfortunate. The material is so rich we can't go into the detail, but it is a phrase which comes from one of the great Psalms of Moses, that God will answer his requests and prayers, ki yada shmi, because he knows my name, which we would tend to interpret today that this Moses understands my attributes. He understands the purpose and meaning of God in Jewish life. That is the underlying idea behind Kulanu Yodei Shemecha. So I don't think we have to belabor the point that the evidence is writ large in the Shacharit service that in addition to the centrality of the first sociological imperative, that in order for a community to survive, there must be order. I didn't at all understand the comment of that very breathless young gentleman who rushed up to the microphone last week and seemed to indicate that this kind of order had something to do with shtadlanut, that the problem was if he seemed to be referring to the American Jewish Committee, not to the conception of Torah, the danger of Jews being too involved in the ruling power, in the Gentile power, which had absolutely nothing to do. The glory of the open microphone is that people can make fools of themselves and make statements that are so unrelated to what was said in the... And I know at the Ritual Committee we've discussed whether the rabbi has an obligation not to permit such illiteracy to be conducted in response to the open microphone, and whether one shouldn't respond to it. I had a rabbi at my dinner table last night, whose name will be unmentioned, who said that they introduced an open microphone, but he insisted on always replying. And he said he did it in such a way that people thought 6 times before they came up with illiteracies in future. Well, of course, we wouldn't want to stifle conversation, but it's very hard when one spends 45 minutes belaboring a point which clearly has nothing to do with shtadlanut, with the way in which certain wealthy Jews have a hotline to the White House and can somehow go behind the democratic grassroots, democratic Jewish organizations or whatever. Although, of course, that is a problem all on its own. When we talk about order, we're not talking about the kind of control that is related to modern Jewish life. We're talking about the very structure of society. The idea of the Midrash, which says God looked into the Torah and created the world, that without order, global structure, a society cannot long endure. You can't have, however nice the idea is, no society, small or large, can long continue on the principle of permanent revolution, which is a contradiction in terms. That was the essential idea, and I mention this only because I noticed somebody applauded in the back row, so apparently the young man wasn't the only one who misunderstood what had been said. And I just wanted to remind you that when we're talking about law and order, we are not talking about the way in which, for example, in the ghetto, there were certain Jews who had power, who betrayed their fellow Jews. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about Torah as a way of life, as a structure of order for the community, so that no matter whether we agree or disagree with the traditional conception of Torah, we have to have some kind of Torah. There has to be some kind of discrimination which tells us who is Jewish and who isn't Jewish. We can't just leave it to our imagination and nostalgia, or to a show of hands. There has to be some structure in the community, whether somebody is married or isn't married, or is divorced or isn't divorced, or whose child belongs to whom. These are not matters which are a matter of personal subjective decision. These are issues on which any community must have some kind of order. It doesn't matter what the order is, there has to be some order which has to be widely accepted by the community. A small group within the community cannot suddenly decide that the earth is flat and then proceed to build various important educational and political implications beyond that. There has to be some kind of a consensus. That's what we mean by order. Whatever the concept of order is, whatever the concept of Torah is, there has to be that order. And this leads again to continuity, the idea of children, the idea of history, which again is a very difficult idea in the 20th century. Again, when I was reading those very funny words of Peter Berger last week, Peter Berger is a conservative. I don't regard myself as a conservative. I don't try, certainly not politically, I don't try to intrude my political views from the pulpit, or if I do, I make quite clear that it's my own personal view. And again, I don't want anybody to think that I endorse everything that Peter Berger said, but he was very funny. I think you'll agree when he was talking about these ideas. The notion, and it came from the 60s, of course, which is still a very sore point to many of us, that just by shouting and leading a riot and overthrowing the existing powers and authorities, one automatically ushers in a brave new world. Unfortunately, matters are not as simple as that. And painful though it may be, society needs both order and continuity. This was very closely related to Peter Berger's definition of a sociologist as a person who was intellectually subversive but politically conservative. That is to say, in terms of society's institutions. I'm not talking about voting as to who should be in the White House or not. When I'm talking about politics, I mean in terms of society as a whole. He says sociology is subversive of established patterns of thought, but conservative in its implications for the institutional order. And I would suggest, and I did suggest, and I suggest again, that if we just take away the word sociology and introduce the word Reconstructionism, we have a very good definition of Reconstructionism, that Reconstructionism is subversive of established patterns of thought, but conservative in its implications for the institutional order. That is to say, Reconstructionism is incompatible with what we call in Jewish tradition hefkerut, chaos, anarchy, although unfortunately that is a growing problem in Reconstructionist life. And he then goes on, the end of his article, to say that the ideal sociologist, he says, is a man who thinks daringly but acts prudently, which I translated as a Reconstructionist is one who thinks treif but acts kosher. This is a kind of an oversimplified way of putting it, but it's a good shorthand way if you want to have unfortunately, a lot of people still confuse Reconstructionism with nothing. Only a few days ago, somebody, a very distinguished, bright, intellectual person, had a conversation with my wife, and apparently my wife was talking about certain aspects of our home life in terms of what happens on a Friday night, and this woman, who's a highly intelligent woman, in touch with all the modern intellectual currents, said, but I didn't think Reconstructionists did that sort of stuff. So unfortunately, there is this unfortunate image in the community that Reconstructionism is compatible with a kind of condition of permanent Jewish revolution, when we throw the mitzvot out of the window and get onto the bandwagon of any current craze or what do they call these things? Fad, yes. The idea that any fad that comes along is automatically given the benediction. Nothing could be further from the truth. And as I said, when I had this delightful conversation with Rabbi Kaplan last week, and I had the privilege of visiting him, the one thing he kept on repeating and showing me in his diary was the need on the part of the Reconstructionist to know the tradition. I wouldn't go so far as to say that the best Reconstructionist is a lapsed Orthodox Jew, because that would be a terrible reflection on all our distinguished Reform members. However, if I understand Rabbi Kaplan correctly, one can't be a Reconstructionist unless one knows the tradition, because one can't reconstruct a vacuum. One can't reconstruct a nothing, a zero, a zilch. And there is a great danger in Reconstructionist life if people are attracted to it because they think it absolves them from the commitment of the study of Torah and the commitment to Jewish education, which is another dimension of the two imperatives, order and continuity. There are many myths around about Reconstructionist thinking. One is that, of course, that it's too cerebral, which apparently nothing that we do or say at the SAJ seems to be able to counter. Only those people who come and actually experience the SAJ realize that it's simply not true, but after a while one just has to allow people to have their myths. And the other myth is that somehow one can choose to be Reconstructionist on the basis of no involvement whatsoever. And this, of course, is a danger, because the kind of people that come from nowhere today are probably the ones who are most ignorant. At least if someone is an Orthodox Jew and has become lapsed, or a conservative Jew at worst, or a Reform Jew at worst, at least one has some nodding acquaintance, one hopes, with some basic outline of Jewish life. But if one comes in from the cold, and then somehow one confers the designation Reconstructionist on what is tantamount to Jewish illiteracy, then we are in grave danger of distorting and misrepresenting the essence of Rabbi Kaplan's teachings, which he asks all of you to read again. He had a little quotation in his diary from Schechter, in which Schechter had said something to him in 1909 when Rabbi Kaplan asked him a question, to which Schechter said, "Read me." And Rabbi Kaplan said, "Read me." In other words, read him. Now, the third imperative, which was the one I think that was most painful to all of us, although it elicited most laughter, was the imperative of triviality. That we can't all be going off our rockers all the time with fantastic, crazy highlights and mind-blowing experiences, happenings. The curse of the 60s, happenings. There has to be a happening. Everybody has to be crying and screaming and yelling. Everybody's kishkas have to be in a constant state of turmoil. We can't live like that, the sociologist tells us. He says, one more, if I may just quote one sentence that I read last week. Fortunately, this is anthropologically unrealizable, though he says the endless discussion that goes on in radical groups, and one might add in certain Reconstructionist groups also, gives a certain approximation of the horror that its realization would signify if every moment had to be meaningful. That is to say, there has to be a rote. Human beings are built because they need things to be mechanistic. There has to be repetition. May I say the phrase, we have to be bored if we are to survive in society. We can't go to cocktail parties and when somebody says, "How are you?" answer the question with a modicum of honesty. We would drive people insane. Social life is posited on deceit and hypocrisy, and we have to accept that. We would go bananas if every time this curse that's spreading over America, aided and abetted by Bell Telephone, of wishing everybody a good day. When you pick up the telephone, yesterday I had to speak to somebody, they wanted me to have a good weekend. I resent this gratuitous attempt on the part of business to change my emotional condition. Perhaps I want to have a depressed weekend. Perhaps I want to have a morbid weekend. Perhaps there are no grounds in my life for having a happy weekend. And if I don't have a depressed and morbid weekend, Monday is going to be intolerable. That is to say, the systole and diastole of emotional life is predicated on the fact that sometimes we have to be bored out of our wits, so that when we finally leave the home or the party, we say to our wives, "My God, another 5 minutes and I would have started screaming." It's part of life. When will we accept the inevitability of hypocrisy? Most human life, and certainly most synagogue life, is only possible on massive denial. Not telling people what we think of them. Not telling people how we think they're doing. You know, you're doing fine. The lies. How many times in a day in this country do we say to people, "You're doing fine," when we mean the opposite? "She has nice eyes." Or, "You look great." To the poor fellow who's dying on his bed, we say, "Hey, you look fantastic." Sometimes, of course, a modicum of truth is essential, but we couldn't live with it all the time. Now, quite independently from an entirely different source, I discovered these three imperatives of human society, and therefore of our own society and our own community, addressed within another context. And that is the reason why I wanted you to turn to page 71, because here the author is not coming from sociology, but coming from psychoanalysis, and also, more specifically, from a psychoanalytical interpretation of world literature, particularly an analytical interpretation of Hamlet. And in fact, this is a problem, of course, that we couldn't put off for very long, the central problem of evil. Something's rotten in the state of Denmark. That's exactly what we're talking about. The fact that human society is based on lies and hypocrisy, and that in order to survive, we have to pretend that it's not there for the most part, because these three imperatives, order, continuity, and triviality. That is to say, it is important that many, many occasions when we meet together are trivial occasions. If every time we got together, we let our hair down and had a rap session and we really told each other what we thought about each other, the institution would perish. What was it that some wise man said? If everybody told everybody everything that they think about each other, nobody would say anybody to anybody. Something of that order. Reflect on it. Think about it. It's nothing bad. It's in the interest of survival. And here we have this benediction on page 71, which indicates that the rabbis were involved with the same problem that we are discussing this morning, of course, in terms of their own phenomenology, on their own wavelength. The problem of evil, the problem of hypocrisy, the problem of lies, the problem of the distortion that must take place if any society is to endure. And above all, the hypocrisy that one is not permitted to describe, because it would drive people out of their minds. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. I read on page 71, Yotzer or uvorei choshech, oseh shalom uvorei et hakol. Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who formest light and createst darkness, who makest peace and createst all things. That is a central problem about the place of lies and distortion and hypocrisy and evil in society, which the rabbis couldn't quite bite the bullet over. In fact, they themselves make a distortion, as I think many of you know, because that particular blessing is based on a verse which is found in the 45th chapter of the book of Isaiah, which runs, Yotzer or uvorei choshech, oseh shalom uvorei ra. That God, I am the Lord, Isaiah runs, and there is none else. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. The author of Isaiah insisted that God creates good and evil. The authors of the liturgy couldn't quite accept that. they wanted everybody to have a good day. And so they changed, the tendency is age-old in human life. They changed the word Ra to Hakol. Bell Telephone Company have a sound Jewish base antecedent, as it were, for, in other words, Boreat Hakol is have a good day, have a happy weekend, have a good time. We can understand the rabbis, and it presents a real problem when we discuss this notion. I want to draw your attention before going on to the other source, which also draws attention to three imperatives if human society is to endure, which in a sense mirror the three sociological imperatives. And this is a remarkable coincidence. That is to say, the sociological imperatives of order, continuity, and triviality are mirrored in three imperatives which the author finds implicit in the book of Hamlet, which he also finds implicit in life in general, and which I suggest are to be found, at least indirectly if not directly, in the Shacharit prayer, and are imperatives which even reconstruct this need in their lives, difficult though this may be when we get to them. Now, I just want to refer to the verb yatsar, which as far as I can ascertain occurs once before. By the way, I should have given the example. Order, of course, the imperative of order is found in the constant references to Torah. Continuity is found in the constant references to children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the continuity of learning, the continuity of teaching, the continuity of fulfilling the mitzvot, going through all the generations. And triviality, there's a marvelously massive trivial section of the morning prayer when we simply read the details of how the sacrifices are to be offered, which we equated last week with the Federal Register. That is to say, it's almost as if, it's so boring, it's almost as if instead of the Shacharit service saying, have a nice day, the Shacharit service is deliberately saying, we would like to set you up for an experience of triviality, next to which anything else that happens during the course of the day is going to be a piece of cheese, a piece of cake. All right? So all you have to do is to read the third part of the introduction, the paragraph which deals with the sacrifice, to realize they're doing us a favor, because, it's like the old Jewish joke of the Jew who bangs his head against the wall. When he stops, it's a machaya. In other words, to leave synagogue after the well-organized traditional Shacharit service, you can survive even the telephone company, because you've had it already. In other words, you've gone through all these various emotions. The word yatsar is used in connection with another interesting blessing, which of course is the blessing for going to the bathroom, or the blessing which you recite when you leave the bathroom. Asher yatsar et hadam, on page 13. This notion of yitzira. Yotzer or, it's the same verb, and it's also related to the verb which is used in the Bible where God is described as making man in the second version of the creation, which of course is the creation story which accepts evil. Unlike the first story, in which the tradition uses the word bara, vayivra, Elohim et Adam b'tzalmo b'tselem Elohim bara oto zachar nekeva bara otam. The word bara is used in the second story, where of course we have the beginning of the problem of evil, the serpent, Eve, the apple, the Garden of Eden, the expulsion, the fall. There we have vayitzer, which is spelt with two yads. Vayitzer Adonai Elohim et Adam. And the rabbinic interpretation of that was very much in line with this blessing as it is found in the original version of Isaiah, that God created man vayitzer with two yitzarim, the word yetzer, again from the word yatsar, two yitzarim, the yetzer hatov and the yetzer hara, which caused Rabbi Kaplan great problems in his attempt to deal with the question of God as creator, which is the subject that we have embarked on this week, but which we will not be able to finish. That is to say, we have over the past several weeks dealt with certain paradoxes, certain oppositions, certain dichotomies in the Shacharit service. We have now discovered that modern sociologists draw our attention to three imperatives without which no human society can long survive, which were already intuitively anticipated in the writings of the ancients in the Shacharit service. The issue of who created the world is ultimately the question of theodicy. Why do so many people not have happy days, so that the telephone company has to offer it to us as an option? This is all bound up ultimately with the question of who created the world. What does it mean to say that God created the world? One of the central themes of the Shacharit service. It's implied in all of the blessings that we recite in the morning, the Birkat HaShachar, which we discussed in some detail, Roka Ha'aretz Al Hamayim, all those blessings, the Psalms, all of them again point out over and over again the central theme: God created the world, but the world is full of evil. How do we reconcile this notion that God created the world with evil? Well, as you know, some ancient religions gave up the game and went into a form of dualism. When Isaiah in chapter 45 verse 7 said that God creates light and darkness, we know from our historical knowledge of Zoroastrianism that this was a polemical statement made against Zoroastrianism, which was centrally and essentially a dualistic religion. The Zoroastrians did not attempt to unite good and evil under one rubric. They did not attempt to wish everybody to have a good day. They accepted the fact that evil was inevitable and that evil was an intrinsic, essential, fundamental part of life. That there were two separate divinities, Ormuzd and Ahriman, Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, the god of light and the god of darkness, that some cosmic disaster happened at the beginning of time, that these two gods fight each other, which is why the world in which we live is an unredeemed world, but that hopefully at the end of days, which is an idea which also profoundly influenced Jewish thinking, the god of light would win a battle over the god of darkness. Now, what Rabbi Kaplan complains about bitterly in the first chapter of The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion, where he devotes a very lengthy section, which I intend to return to in weeks to come, about what possible meaning the God of creation, or the God who creates, can have for us, admits that in fact in Jewish tradition there is not total agreement on whether the principle of evil has a separate autonomous power. And he argues with the notion of dualism. Rabbi Kaplan wants to accept this notion that good and evil can all be subsumed under the notion of the power that makes for salvation, but admits, I quote, "It must not be assumed that traditional Jewish religion presents us with consistent and unvarying patterns of its main teachings. This is scarcely the case with anything that has come down from the past, but it is in its dealing with the problem of evil that traditional Jewish religion has most often swerved from the line of consistency. This is illustrated by its occasional lapses into a kind of microcosmic dualism. Though the Jewish religion managed to suppress all dualistic conceptions of the macrocosm, that is to say, he is referring to this bracha, Yotzeir or uvorei choshech, oseh shalom uvorei et hakol uvorei ra. Although the Jewish religion managed to suppress all dualistic conceptions of the macrocosm, the world as a whole, it failed to do so in its interpretation of human nature. Instead of treating the natural instincts and impulses in man as in need of being controlled and coordinated, it hypostasized the desires and hungers of men as the evil Yetzer, as the tool through which Satan sought to undo the work of God. The serpent that tempted Eve attained the status of a demigod. In the Kabbalah, he is the great enemy. Life in accordance with the law of God is conceived as a struggle against a host of inner enemies that beset the soul. The passage in Deuteronomy which contains ordinances pertaining to war is reinterpreted as applying to the war against the evil Yetzer. Throughout the days of penitence, the Jews read the 27th Psalm to avow their confidence in God despite the hosts with which the enemy besieged them. Again, enemy is a metaphor for the hostile forces that prevent man from attaining his purpose in life. The evil Yetzer became a sort of rival to God, contesting for the possession of the soul of man. Thus, he says, even the Jews have not yet realized the full implications of their own monotheistic teachings. Those are very heavy words, because Rabbi Kaplan himself on the next page does not fully accept monotheism himself when he admits that whilst we would like to subsume good and evil under one heading, it is impossible to blame God for things like concentration camps. He doesn't actually say that because this is 1936 when The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion was published. And of course much of what he talks about evil there has to be seen in an entirely new light when one reads it in 1981 after the Holocaust, after Vietnam, after the assassination of Martin Luther King and 2 Kennedys and so on and so forth, and in the presence of all the evil that still plagues us in the world today. So this is a very complex issue which we are not going to resolve in one morning. Let me then put that issue of whether God is responsible for evil as well as for good, which, as Rabbi Kaplan admits, is somewhat ambiguous in Jewish tradition. The Jews wanted to insist against Zoroastrianism that there is only one force in the world, and evil must be understood in terms of that force. Zoroastrian says you're wasting your time. You'll never present to any human being the idea that one principality, one power, one force is responsible for everything. The Jews said yes and no. Macrocosmically, we would like to believe that God is responsible for everything. But microcosmically, when we experience man in the raw and we experience ourselves, it does look as if there is a devil. It does look as if Satan is trying to seduce us. It does look as if we can't just pull ourselves together, that there are things which try to overwhelm us that we have not got total control over, at least in this particular world. Now, the source which our second author deals with is introduced by this paragraph, which is quite remarkable because I have no reason to believe that Peter Berger read this. He says there is another myth to be found in Hamlet, a myth that has to do with the community, the kehillah. He doesn't use that word. Its cohesion and the relationship of each of his members to it. Most people, despite occasional protestations to the contrary, feel happier in a humdrum sort of existence. Quite independently, by a psychoanalytical study of literature, he has arrived at the same notion that the sociologists arrived at from their contemplation of human society. You must permit me one more digression. What would a sermon from me be without digressions? We all should be acknowledging of our faults. Here is a lovely story. Towards the end of his life, Max Weber was asked by a friend to whom he had been explaining the pessimistic conclusions of his sociological analysis, but if you think this way, why do you continue doing sociology? Does anybody understand that question? You see, one of the big problems in life is to look at the world as the world is without denying. When one does that, one realizes there are some nice Gentiles around. If one wants to be a good Jew, one can't admit that to oneself, and certainly not to one's children, at least not until they're married to nice Jewish people. That is to say, the curse of living in the modern world is that there are so many different societies, there are so many different cultures, that short of being raised in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, I don't think even Ramaz helps. Sorry. I think the acid test is whether you have a television set. I don't think any home in which there is a television is going to escape this global village idea, the idea that there's so many options, which of course is what sociology does so much to destroy our way of thinking and our mental balance when we study it. That is to say, it shows us hundreds of different ways of living, each of which are equally enjoyable by the adherents. You don't have to be a Jew to feel that you're a member of the chosen people. You don't have to be a Jew to have ritual. You don't have to be a Jew to have a Sabbath. You don't have to be a Jew to want your daughters and your sons to marry within the faith. It doesn't have to be the Jewish faith. Other people feel just as excitable. Italians feel just as bad when their children bring home people who are not Italians, especially if they are deeply ethnic Italians. And that becomes very, very disconcerting. One suddenly realizes that having been born into the Jewish people is something fortuitous. It was contingent, but it wasn't necessary. But it doesn't do to think about this too much. It doesn't do to think about this too much any more than it pays to reply to somebody who asks you at a cocktail party, how you doing? And giving them the truth right from their hip. That is to say, it's better to build walls around ourselves. It's better to keep as much away from other people who have different views and perspectives on living from our own as much as possible, unless we want to go insane. And endemic and basic to sociology, and I insist, unfortunately, that this is also basic and endemic to Reconstructionism, unfortunately, but it has not yet been fully appreciated that Reconstructionism is inimical to mental health, because it makes us see all cultures as possessing sancta, and all cultures as offering an equal possibility of experiencing God. There is no such thing, Kaplan says, as a Jewish God. I want a Jewish God. There is no such thing as a Jewish idea of God. I want a Jewish idea of God. There is only the Jewish application of the God idea. That is very disconcerting, especially if you want to sing Zemirot on Friday night. It is better not to think that your application of the idea of God is just a Jewish idea, but next door they have a Catholic idea, and they can be singing Nearer My God to Thee, or whatever Catholics sing on Friday night, if they sing at all on Friday night, or whatever else they sing. It's much easier. I don't think, see, Rabbi Kaplan's mind is so phenomenal. I mean, he makes more sense to me at 99 than several members of this congregation. Now, that's a very incredible thing to be able to do at 99. So with a mind like that, you can dabble with all these dangerous thoughts and still come up shouting Shema Yisrael. But those naked and vulnerable little children that go to Columbia and Barnard, who take Sociology 1, they don't have the mind of a Kaplan. And when they begin to understand what Reconstructionism is saying is that there is no such thing as Jewish religion which is different from everything else in the world, but that all peoples have religion and all peoples have sancta, then the question arises, why are their sancta worse than ours and why are ours better than theirs? Now, although Rabbi Kaplan rejects the idea of a chosen people, he comes very close to it, as all of you who have studied his writings know, by saying, well, we did the best of a lot of bad jobs, that although we are not chosen, ours is better. That's the message that comes so ultimately from Judaism civilization and its subsequent version. That is to say, somehow in the Jewish people, the God idea reached its highest fruition. But of course that came about only because we didn't have a land and a territory and an army and a navy and an air force. And now that we are going back to, quote, normality, I say quote normality because normality includes Commentary magazine, so I put quotations around normality. We're finding that it's not so easy to maintain these ethical and moral values and to be superior morally to the rest of the world, and thereby maintain the superiority of Judaism even in moral terms. So toward the end of his life, Max Weber was asked by a friend to whom he had been explaining the pessimistic conclusions of sociological analysis. That is to say, when you study sociology, the walls of the synagogue suddenly become transparent. You can see through them to the people who are doing their thing next door. And sometimes what they're doing next door looks a little more exciting than what you're doing in here. And you begin to have second doubts as to whether what you're doing in here is the absolute truth. And that becomes extraordinarily disconcerting. And of course, it doesn't have to be a religious institution. It can be a political institution. You can be thinking that way about American democracy. And you can see how American democracy on some level doesn't compare that favorably with other ways of life which other peoples have selected, because we haven't got rid of hypocrisy, and we haven't gotten rid of evil, and we haven't gotten rid of man's inhumanity to man, although we tell ourselves a very good story at election times. We make good promises to each other, but on the bottom line, in terms of the oppression and the persecution, how much progress have we in fact made? So somebody said to Max Weber, to whom he had been explaining the pessimistic conclusions of his sociological analysis, but if you think this way, why do you continue doing sociology? Weber's reply is one of the most chilling statements I know in the history of Western thought, because I want to know how much I can stand. Alfred Seidel, who was a student of Weber and who was also greatly influenced by Freud, came to an even more pessimistic conclusion in his little book appropriately entitled Bewusstsein als Verhängnis, Consciousness as Doom. That is to say, bliss is not to become conscious. But we have to remind ourselves that one of the central imperatives of Reconstructionism is thou shalt be self-conscious. Thou shalt know the meaning and purpose of Jewish life, not thou shalt worship as a Jew. Because in a sense, the question may be raised, can one indeed worship as a Jew if one is fully self-conscious of all the implications that it means to be a Jew in the 20th century? Seidel concluded that the combined critical consciousness of sociology and psychoanalysis was not only politically subversive, but inimical to life itself. Whatever other motives they have been, he committed suicide in 1920. And that was an existential ratification of the view of the bringing to consciousness of sociology. I wish I could bring you better news, my dear friends, but unfortunately there are certain realities about the thinking that we approach or endeavor to do here which must be endured. There is another myth to be found in Hamlet, a myth that has to do with the community, its cohesion, and the relationship of each of its members to it. Most people, despite occasional protestations to the contrary, feel happier in a humdrum sort of existence. We're back to the imperative of triviality. One that has relatively small oscillations of excitement. It helps them to fulfill their societal functions with a minimum of upset. It also provides at least halfway protection against traumatic injury. Who is it that at the beginning of his maturity feels drawn toward the great adventure, which always contains the possibility of shattering defeat, toward that insatiable search for the truth that may in the end result in involuntary isolation from the community? Who, one may ask in a general way, wants to make full use of his liberty? Is it permissible to ask that question in a Reconstructionist congregation where we are so wedded to the idea of liberty and freedom that we drive each other crazy with our prayers? Liberty, we say we want. Freedom, we want. Our author is asking a very important question. Do we really want freedom to that extent, or in moderation? Do we want liberty to that extent, or in moderation? The problems, he goes on, that are involved in freedom or liberty have occupied thinkers unendingly. Here I want to turn my attention toward only one document, Dostoevsky's famous episode of the Great Inquisitor, which I regard as a deep, you know this, it's a story within the brothers Karamazov. There's no way of reading the story to you in synagogue. If you have Brothers Karamazov at home, read it please, because we're going to come back to this theme next week, and if you don't have Brothers Karamazov, you should buy it. Together with the Oedipus trilogy, Karamazov and Hamlet perhaps represent the three greatest attempts on the part of mankind to solve the problem raised in the 45th chapter of Isaiah, verse 7, emended by the rabbis because they couldn't quite face that pessimistic and chilling conclusion which is implicit in the answer that God creates good and evil, and that God, one might add, created or was responsible on some level for sociology and psychoanalysis, which perhaps is an even more challenging threat to human mental stability. Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor, he says, I regard as a deep sociological essay presented in the form of a literary piece. That's exactly what we are doing with the Shacharit service. We are applying to it the same kind of analysis. The Shacharit is ours. Why should we do Hamlet in synagogue or Karamazov or Dostoevsky, except only insofar as they throw light on Yiddishkeit? And of course the assumption behind all this is the Socrates remark, the unexamined life is not worth living, and the centrality of self-consciousness in a well-ordered religious humanistic reconstructionist life. I say that, but I must admit, not with total conviction, because I have to feel that if every reconstructionist became as self-conscious as possibly he could become, then the suicide rate would rise to a very high level in reconstructionist circles, which I think even the worst of us don't want really to happen, right? So let's think of this. I want to turn my attention toward one document, Dostoevsky's famous episode of the Grand Inquisitor, which I regard as a deep sociological essay presented in the form of a literary piece. Scarcely anyone who has ever pondered on the problem of freedom and liberty has taken a more pessimistic view with regard to man's inner capacity to endure freedom. There is no chance, of course, that any member of an industrialized republic that bases its official political structure on liberty will fully understand Dostoevsky's formidable statement. And I repeat this statement with great trepidation in the SAJ, because I know how profoundly we here feel that liberty and freedom are so important that no matter where the chips fall, we must pursue them relentlessly, no matter what damage or depredations be perpetrated on the body politic. Dostoevsky's formidable statement that for man and the human community, never and nowhere has anything existed that is more unbearable than liberty. Likewise, when he speaks of the unsolvable historical contradictions of human nature, the unsolvable historical contradictions of human nature, that is to say, he is disagreeing, as indeed I do, with Rabbi Kaplan's optimistic liberalism expressed quite succinctly for anybody to behold in the opening chapters of The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion. I will concede that this was written 3 years before the Second World War began. On the other hand, no Reconstructionist literature subsequent to the Second World War has taken cognizance of this problem other than the writings of Richard Rubinstein. I hope some of you read the book review last week of a book by the Catholic theologian Hans Küng, written by a Gentile theologian who took Hans Küng to task in a book on God for not having read Richard Rubinstein's book after Auschwitz. It is a sad comment on the extent to which Jewish people world over deny, I'm using denial now in its technical sense, that it takes a non-Jewish theologian to remind another non-Jewish theologian to read one of the most important, though the most pessimistic and chilling books to have been written since the Second World War, which Jews in general and Reconstructionists in particular still continue to ignore. Rubinstein's challenge grows right out of the attempt to make God monolithically responsible for good and evil. Rubinstein denies that is possible and prefers to revert to the pagan doctrine that evil or the powers of evil are by themselves, we can attempt to deal with them, but we cannot totally get rid of them, and on some level they are endemic and intrinsic to human life. That is to say, the notion that what this author refers to as the unsolvable historical contradictions of human nature. In response to this challenge, Rabbi Kaplan says, if we believe that the cosmos is so constituted as to fulfill man's ideal aspirations, then we can regard evil as something that is interim, the unredeemed part of life, which one day, when we get around to it, spend enough money on it, have enough PhDs working on it, we will be able to resolve. Rubinstein, and the author of this book, is saying something completely different. And as you well know, if you've been coming to the synagogue in the last several years, that I have uncomfortably and painfully to agree that the historical contradictions of human nature are not things that one day will be ironed out when we discover the right kind of drug or perfect the 45 or 50-minute hour. Unfortunately, these are crucial and endemic and central to the human condition. Every child who is born is tarred with this brush. If you want to call it original sin, be my guest. If you want to call it the Yetzer Hara, which is what the rabbis did, contradicting the other half of their philosophy, which was an endeavor to create a God who created good and evil, be my guest. If you want to express it in terms of Richard Rubinstein's existentialist theology, in terms of the attitude of an Albert Camus to an attitude of the cosmos as absurd, within which nevertheless man must affirm man's freedom and man's ability to choose. Be my guest also, as long as we understand that these concepts are precisely what was affirmed by our ancestors in the Shacharit service, and by virtue of the fact that the rabbis could not quote Isaiah directly and say that God oseh shalom over Ira, but had to yield to their own fear of this chilling pessimism. They couldn't give this bracha to us. It was too much for them. So they changed the word to hakol to attempt to smooth it over, which was their way of saying, have a nice day. Well, there are all sorts of options. When Dostoevsky speaks of the unsolvable historical contradictions of human nature, this can easily be brushed aside as a fancy of a mind that has been misled by an excess of religious sentiment and by the impact that his own environment has had on him in the form of an excessively autocratic political structure with a strong Christian flavor. Be that as it may, it often happens that when the human mind has been excessively tormented, it will draw out of its sufferings myths that contain the profoundest truths. Permit me to quote one more paragraph. When one studies scientific works about the structure of society, and I don't have to tell you that one of the biggest criticisms Rabbi Kaplan was faced with was the criticism that he wasn't a theologian. He was a sociologist. If you look in the 1957 edition of Judaism as Civilization, when he apologizes for allowing a book that was written in 1934 to be reprinted without a radical change, because he didn't accept anymore the idea of the chosen people, which he still tries to save in the first version, the 1934 version of Judaism as Civilization. And he also accepts that Reform Judaism has changed since the Columbia Platform of 1937, when the Reform Jews rejected the notion that the Jews were not a people and insisted that the Jews were a people, and also on the centrality of Zionism, therefore making the criticisms that Rabbi Kaplan made of Reformist Judaism in the opening chapters of Judaism Civilization anachronistic, out of date. Nevertheless, he said, I want to let people know what I was thinking about 1934, and then tries to answer the criticism which clearly hurt him, because it's only when you respond to a criticism that people know they've got through to you. And therefore, if one is criticized, it's best to ignore it, because then nobody knows how you're thinking about it. But this accusation of sociology got right through. And he says, I don't care if you accuse me of being a sociologist. A doctor who diagnoses somebody who's sick uses physics and chemistry also, in a way. And if I'm trying to diagnose what's wrong with the Jewish people, and I need to use sociology, and I wish he would have added psychoanalysis, although of course he didn't, because psychoanalysis is totally ignored throughout the corpus of Kaplan's writings, which is why it's very important to try to bring both those disciplines to bear, both of those pessimistic disciplines to bear. They're both very pessimistic about the inconsistencies, the historical contradictions of human nature, but they are very close to honesty. We have to treat them very carefully. So there's no need to be uncomfortable about that. Rabbi Kaplan is aware that he's accused of sociological tendencies, but we need them in order to understand Judaism in the modern world. When one studies scientific works about the structure of society, one may readily get the impression one gets from pre-Freudian psychology. What was recorded there was not necessarily wrong, yet one feels it was not man who was truly the subject of that inquiry. Similarly, it does not seem to be the core of society that is the subject of contemporary sociological scrutiny, but rather peripheral, non-essential phenomena. In reading the Grand Inquisitor, one feels immediately that what the Inquisitor is debating is core patterns, core factors, the nuclear conflict of human community. And here Dostoevsky asserts three factors essential to community, which I find strangely parallel the three sociological imperatives which Peter Berger arrived at quite independently. And these three factors, which Dostoevsky regarded as essential to community, and which are so difficult for reconstructionists to even think about without getting excited. But I'm suggesting that we do try to think about them without getting excited. We can disagree with them, but let's think about them without being excited. These three factors are miracle, secret, and authority. All three are revealed in Hamlet. The miracle of the ghost's appearance, the secret of the murder of the former king, and the authority of Hamlet to set right the time that is out of joint. We'd like to have a few minutes discussion this morning. I'm going to end at this point in medias res, as they say, without having tied this up. But I think we can see immediately that in terms of miracle, the notion of the revelation of the Torah is a central theme in classical Jewish literature in general and in the Shacharit service in particular. That the concept of secret points to the notion of triviality, that you can't let everything hang out if society or community is to endure. No matter how evil the structure is, no matter how wicked, no matter how hypocritical, there are times when to draw attention to those dimensions doesn't serve survivalist purposes. There's a marvelous Hebrew phrase which is Yikov Hadin et Hahal. Let the judgment penetrate the mountain, which could be translated, I suppose, into Latin as Fiat Justitia Ruat Caelum. Let there be justice, even though their heavens fall down. But who would want their heavens to fall down every morning as one is making coffee for breakfast? I don't think it's fair to throw this to you right now, but since so many of you feel so unhappy, if there isn't an immediate, instant replay I think this is bound up with the problem of triviality and authority and secret and miracle somehow, but nevertheless I think we should pay cognizance to it. But I do hope that if comments are made, they won't confuse us more than we are confused already, on at least a higher level, and be pertinent and relevant to the subject that is being discussed, which I am trying to articulate as clearly as I know how. We will continue this subject in weeks to come.
Shabbat Shalom. My name is Tamar Crystal, and I'd like to welcome all our guests here on behalf of the community. The open microphone is a chance to respond to some of the ideas and concepts that have just been presented. We have a few simple rules. We ask that you, if you come up, state your name, whether you're a member or a guest. Keep it pertinent and keep it under 3 minutes. Microphone is now open.
Shabbat Shalom. My name is Ethan Golagor. I'm a member. Clearly, it would take a masochist to get up here after the requirements, but I won't comment on that. I think 3 minutes was never enough to respond to the... Thank you. Was never enough to respond to the hour-long sermon. Clearly, it's not enough to respond to a semester's worth of sermons. Therefore, I agree with the rabbi that perhaps responding this way is not the best way, but might I suggest then that the ritual committee or the subcommittee on rabbinical responses find a more appropriate forum in which to do it, perhaps next week or the week after, or whenever this semester is over. A whole session might be devoted to responses. I think there is a lot to say, and I don't think these 3 minutes are the best time to say it. Having said that, however, I do want to make 1 or 2 comments in defense of this open microphone, and I think that is relevant since it has come up in the last couple of weeks as an object of discussion, and apparently over the last 3 or 4 months has also been discussed in committee. It is, as I said, I don't think the best forum in which everything can occur, but somehow I feel compelled to defend it for a moment. The psychologists I once used to know sometimes made frequent use of a concept called being over-defended. The number of arguments that someone would use to defend their innocence tended psychoanalytically to point to their guilt. When are you going to return my roller skates? Well, in the first place, I never borrowed them, and in the second place, I already gave them back to you. And in the third place, they were broken when I got them, and in the fourth place, I thought you were giving them to me. I didn't think you were loaning them to me. I think we can introduce a concept here relevant to the open microphone of being over-attacked. The number and richness and complexity and diversity and multifarious arguments used to attack it, to indicate its guilt, I think suggests perhaps its innocence. I don't think this little head can withstand all of those arguments. In the first place, it's a forum for impassioned people to come up and say things without reflection. In the second case, it's abused. In the third case, the rabbi never intended it to be used every week. In the fourth place, how could we possibly find an appropriate response to arguments which are not as yet formulated? In the fifth place, it's a vestige of some primordial time of an open culture which has long since passed. In the sixth and the seventh and the eighth. Take another minute. The richness and complexity of them make me think it's innocent. I think the first speaker last week was correct in saying that even if this is not the best forum to respond, it certainly fits in with the pattern here. If the thesis is going to be presented on page 1 in bold headlines, then I don't think the antithesis should be presented on page 33 in an erratum. That model is not the New York Review of Books. Perhaps that model is Vestia.
With great respect to Ethan, that's exactly the argument. It was a perfect example of why the open microphone should not be used. Because in response to a question to deal with the material of what was talked about, instead we get a psychological analysis of my guilt feelings about the subject. The fact of the matter is it's very closely related to the conception of triviality. During the 60s, everything had to be with it all the time. Nobody could get up. No person of authority could ever stand up anywhere without constantly having to defend himself from every single point of view. One of the drawbacks of being in a synagogue, which is a reconstructed synagogue, where we believe that we are progressive because of our name, is that sometimes we forget when we make orthodoxies about things that were once progressive. We have an adult education committee where seminars can be planned and other kinds of programs arranged. But it seems to me that a phenomenon which was spawned in the 60s and bears all the traces of its original paternity is not being used effectively in the 1980s. The question is, can it be used effectively? Occasionally, we have had moments of brightness. Unfortunately, the principle of triviality seems to apply, that you have to have 99 phenomena of boredom before you get one really good discussion. I think that's been the experience of many people in the congregation, and I'm just feeling a little uncomfortable. It's not that people shouldn't feel that they can respond, but that when the open microphone is used for just shooting off and not dealing with the main central theme, one wonders whether its purpose is being fulfilled. I really feel that people should reflect on the implications. It has a lot to do with the theme that we are talking about, including the whole conception of authority, which is a terribly difficult problem in American life. This country has great difficulty with any kind of authority. It always had. It began with toppling a king off a throne, and in general, there seems to be a tendency to fail to understand what teaching can be within the framework of the synagogue. I hope that in weeks to come, when the microphone is open, and when a request is made to deal with the issues relating to what has been discussed, we might be able to focus on the issues that actually were discussed. We rise for Aleinu on page 192.